Welcome back to Bored All the Time. I know you were expecting episode 1 to drop today, but because we realized that Tuesdays would be a better choice to release our main episodes, we decided to release a little bit of a supplemental episode today. Scott and I have decided to do a small little series where we're each going to record and talk about the games that made us. Games from our childhood or from early in our board gaming careers that were important to who we are as board gamers and potentially even as people. So I get to start the series off with a game that is near and dear to my heart, a game called Tenacity. Tenacity was released in either 1982 or 1983, I forget which, but it is an economic game where you are running a retail store in the 80s. It uses roll and move mechanisms to take your turn. And like many games of that era, if you roll doubles multiple times, you would either gain or lose money, depending on how many doubles were rolled. Unlike many of the games at that time, though, you just kept rolling until you stopped rolling doubles, so you could lap the board many, many times. It's a resource management game that has you buying and selling various commodities from the bank. Depending on events that will occur from the 4 decks around the board, you will either gain or lose money based on the stock you have, and there are many ways to manipulate that same stock. Maybe trading between players, it may end up in the center of the board, you may just straight lose it because of a terrible action. Because of the way the movement works and the relative brutality of the decks, it is a fairly swingy, fairly lucky game. Now, you may be wondering why you've never heard of this old game from the 80s. And to be fair, there's a lot of old games from the 80s you've probably not heard of, but this one in particular, the reason you probably haven't heard of it is that my dad made it. It was made, like I said, in the early 80s era where my sister had just been born, which is why Tenacity was released under Alexis Productions. It was her name. And my dad and my mom and my Uncle Tom and my Aunt Sandy, and I'm not sure who else, sat around with my dad, who was a retail manager at the time, and they built this game. He got it all printed up locally, but they had to assemble all of it. So there were rubber bands and paper cuts and little plastic chits and all the things you would expect from a game of that time. And the fun part about it is we had so many of those extra components laying around, even just boxes of the games. And I knew my dad created the game as a kid, but I never actually clicked it all together to sit there and think, oh, we have all these rubber bands because of Tenacity. I was in my 20s and I was still finding bags of these rubber bands in use in our house. And I looked at my dad one day and I'm like, why have we kept these rubber bands for so long? And he looked at me and said, oh, because that's what we had left over from Tenacity. That's how many we had. The game has such fun components. Big, super chunky money. I mean, it is just ludicrously oversized. And I don't know if it was under legal advisement or because my dad thought somebody would try to use it, but every denomination, which is in hundreds and thousands, all say not legal tender. And it was one of my favorite things as a kid. And of course, as you're a little kid running around and you see all this stuff, I used it in my everyday gameplay, in my imaginary stuff. I remember when Chrono Trigger came out, I was obsessed. I was 8 years old when it came out. And one of the most fun parts of the game to me was the Millennial Fair. And in the Millennial Fair, you collect silver points. And most of the employee chits we had left over were these clear discs. And we had some green ones and we had some blue ones, but I always in my brain thought of them as silver points. And so I would play games with my friends and I would play games with imaginary friends thinking, oh, these are the silver points that I'm earning in the Millennial Fair. And we had all those extra little player tokens, those pawns that you know from every game back in the day. And they were shooting targets for Nerf guns. They were barriers for racing cars. They were all kinds of these things. And we had all these dice left over. And they were little D6s. And what's funny is I have a gigantic jar of D6s on my desk because, of course I do, until I opened up a copy to sit through and sift through the cards and get all the memories back. I didn't realize that all those little white D6s were also from Tenacity. So even this far into my life, I am discovering where these little things are coming from. The rules themselves for an economic game are very straightforward. It's roll the dice, move, be at the mercy of whatever happens, essentially. You're given $60,000 in assets at the start of the game, half of that in cash and half of that in stocks that are randomly assigned out. But you're also given 10 employees. And the employees are such an interesting part of the game because you start with 10 of them. And when you end the game, you want to still have 10 of them. Any variance in that number is going to cost you $1,000 per either way. And at any time, if you run out of employees and you cannot pay your assets, you're out of the game. But more dangerously, if you are low on employees, 2, 3, or 4, you can be booted out of the game by 3 of the 4 different decks. I went through and I checked all this for this. You have to maintain your employees, you have to maintain assets, because the cards in the 4 decks will toss you from gaining employees to losing inventory to having things stolen from you, or, my God, the tornado. I hate that tornado. I have hated that tornado since I was a kid. And even going into the game that I ran through with it, I looked at the Fate deck and I thought, I know the tornado's in there somewhere, and I absolutely hate that thing. So when you go to the Fate deck, it is always am I going to get hit with the tornado? And it's so bad because it costs you $60,000. So it can literally wipe out all of your assets in a single go. Not to say the other decks weren't as brutal, and I forgot how brutal they were, because they can cost you $40,000. Or I had something happen where it said you lose all of your cash to the bank. That was almost $100,000. It is so brutal and rough that I remember playing it as a kid and feeling like it was so long at times, because you could just get kicked in the teeth over and over and over again. And in reality, it's actually not a long game. The box even says it's quick. And you know what? It's true. But man, it is rough. I went through and I counted the cards. There are 30 in each of the 4 decks, and by far, they are negative consequences. Almost across the board, they are negative consequences. The Fate deck is almost 2-to-1 bad things. And of course, in that deck, things just cost more because that's Fate showing up. The other 3 decks are related to economic factors, the stock market's going up, or you manage to make a smart investment in something. There's management, which largely rotates around the employees and needing to fire them, needing to hire them. And then there's sales, which is the only just generally good deck because it's actually going to allow you to use your inventory as positive collateral most of the time. Cash is cash in the game, but the inventory cards are worth $2,000 a piece on face value. However, you can't use them as liquid currency unless you have no other real option. So you have this really interesting balance of keeping physical items because you can make things off of them, and they are an investment for you, but it is very, very costly to lose them because you will almost always be losing them at less than what they are worth. The game is clearly driven from my dad's experiences. I think he must have been feeling a little negative on it at the time because of just how many cards are brutal, but I can feel my dad, especially the dad of my childhood, of that pure retail, like believe in yourself and just go and do. I remember sitting at the table with my family on nights after getting Pizza Hut and playing it. I remember sitting there with friends and teaching them, and all of us sitting there and just shaking our hands at the skies because that tornado hit, or the fire hit, or the employee theft hit, because that hits you for $40,000 and 4 employees. And it was so much fun. I had so much fun with that game because it was just good memories. And it was something that I know my dad had some complicated feelings about because it was so much work for them. And I don't know that it ever really did gangbusters. We certainly had plenty of them in my basement, but it was sold in local regional stores. And there are people that have copies of it. It is somebody else added it to BGG. There's some fun ratings on it. Generally speaking, it has a good rating. Tenacity is something that has been a connective point for my dad and I for the majority of my life. And through the course of my adult life, he's wanted us to work on redoing it, maybe seeing what a modern take on it would look like. And what's fun is sitting there and playing it again recently, I realized how many opportunities there are for a second edition or reimplementation or whatever, because so many of the ideas were driven out of that experience, out of that love for what he did. And so the theme comes through for being very basic components, cardboard cards that were hand cut and hand wrapped in these tiny little rubber bands. They feel like what they say they are. Because it's the 80s, it's so fun to look at the cards and the inventory choices, because those inventory choices, decorative wicker, like awesome, right? You have fur coats and you have gold watches, and it's just stuff that is so emblematic at the time. And there was a card in, I think, the management deck that says, you invested wisely in computers and they're speeding you up. And it's just like, man, how of the times is that, but how interesting that it is that that's there. So that's Tenacity. It's incredibly hard to find now. I don't know how many copies there really are left in the wild. I know my dad has a couple boxes left. I broke the plastic on my copy that is 40 some years old, and I sat down and I played with it. And you know what? I had a great time. Tenacity is absolutely a game that made me, and I am so happy it is part of my story. Thanks for indulging me as I got to walk down memory lane with this game. It was a lot of fun to do it. We'll be dropping episode 1 on Tuesday, and I hope that you join us for that. It's been a lot of fun doing this project so far, and I am so excited you're here with us.